Hey guys, it's Abel here with the Sustainable Self-Development Podcast, and the day arrived. Dr. Mike Israetel and Dr. Eric Helms are going to have a debate about bulking, or whether you should bulk faster or slower. Should you have a bigger caloric surplus and gain more weight, or should you have a smaller surplus and gain smaller increments per unit of time, and thereby, by definition, bulk for longer. This will be the topic of this debate, and you'll have two freaking PhDs debate over it. Sounds too good to be true? Well, yeah, it kind of is, but it is still absolutely happening. So we'll jump right in because you'll skip ahead anyway. But please be sure to check out these guys' resources. If your goal is to build muscle and you want to have absolute top-notch science-based information on it, then you definitely want to check out the links I put in the description. Researching and educating people over how to get jacked in the most time-efficient and effective manner is the livelihood of these guys. So do yourself a favor and check out the courses, books, and research reviews that these guys produce. You'll find the links in the description, and they will be mentioned in the end of this episode as well. Also use the timestamps to navigate between the topics we discuss. And hey, if you can count the amount of times I said the word excellent in this episode, you'll get a bonus smiley face from me. And now the debate starts. Is this really happening, or am I just imagining this?
Imagination.
Yeah. Most of the time I walk through life in a fugue state, so I actually don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, you should probably remember, Abel, that homeless man that gave you 10 grams of mushrooms that you ate 30 minutes ago. They're kicking in now, so you're actually in your apartment crying by yourself.
Yeah, and that wouldn't surprise me because we are going to talk about bulking with Eric Helms and Mike Israetel. I'm really excited to actually do this with you guys because this is one of those topics like the reverse diet was back in the day, or the training frequency topic was recently, where a lot of people have heard the two of you separately discuss this concept on various podcasts and articles, solo videos, all of that stuff. And you seem to have a somewhat differing, although of course not completely opposing stance on this matter. And then people always turn to either one of you to ask about your stances on what the other person said. So now it's finally a good chance for both of you to voice your views on this. Exactly what you just said. Yeah. I guess I'll just jump right into this whole thing with my first question to Mike, which is how would you define, in a general sense, what defines a successful bulking process in terms of caloric surplus, duration of the bulking period? How should that look like for most people for optimal results?
So I think that, you're usually going to have a surplus of calories on daily that will be between 150 and 500 calories in most cases. I think you'll seek to gain somewhere between, depending on your particular demographics and various other constraints, 1/4 pound to a pound of scale weight or tissue, but proxied by scale weight per week. I think that your one stretch of amassing phase should last anywhere between, usually between 2 and 4 months. But I would say not much shorter for a variety of reasons I can state later, and not much longer for a variety of reasons I can state later. And I think the fraction of muscle versus fat that you gain is dependent on still other very many factors. But I honestly think that a 50-50 split is really good for an intermediate, and for the advanced, 50-50 is probably unrealistic. And you're looking for a good result of 25% of that being muscle, something like 75% being fat. I think the 75-25 the other way, 75 muscle, 25 fat, is reserved mostly for the beginner. And that's how I would define a successful bulking phase in its basic parameters.
Right. That was great. And now I'm turning to you, Eric, with the same question. So how would you define a successful bulking period in terms of the method? And would there be any points that you would address differently than Mike just did?
So yeah, great question. And in many ways, I agree with Mike. I think there should be a caloric surplus. And I think if anything, we differ just in the severity of it, or rather the size of it, I should say. I typically recommend rates that fall between gaining about 1 to 3 pounds per month on average. Another way to look at it is about 0.5 to 1.5% of your body weight per month, which is a nice way to scale to whether you're male, female, tall, short, larger, or smaller. Because in the end, the actual tissues that are growing are happening at every single tissue level of muscle you have, which is your whole body. It does need to be scaled to your size, and more reasonable rates need to be relative to where you're starting. And then within that range, the rate, instead of just it being a percentage that is scaled to your initial size, you also need to scale it to your training age. And like Mike was saying, I completely agree that the likelihood of you gaining all muscle, especially at a larger surplus, at a larger rate of weight gain, which are essentially the same thing, becomes slimmer and slimmer, no pun intended, as you become advanced. Because as you get closer and closer to your genetic ceiling, it's unlikely that you'll be able to put on lots of muscle all at once. So there are a couple ways to approach that. You can take shorter massing phases interspersed by mini cuts, which I think is certainly reasonable. What I find works equally as well in more advanced lifters is to just slow it down a lot and look to gain, say, something like 6 pounds over 6 months, and then assess and see whether or not you've pushed your body fat too high. I don't personally see any issue with long-term phases of gaining. I also don't necessarily have an issue with going back and forth with mini cuts and bulking. The typical reason I don't recommend that as much is because advanced lifters, they tend to kind of want to hold on to that idea that they can still go through those quote-unquote bulking phases that occurred when they were novices or early-stage intermediates and have them be successful. And more often what I find occurs is they just kind of get sloppy over and over and over again and put on really not any more measurable amount of muscle than they would have had they just slowed it down. And I find that's just not fun for most people and impractical. And you end up spending more time in a deficit than you would have to. To me, that seems like probably taking away from the productivity of the overall off-season. And the final caveat I'll put in all of this is that I've worked with hundreds of high-level and mid-level and low-level drug-free lifters, and like 2 just kind of randomly people who are enhanced. So this is very much advice based on the very limited research we have and also my experience with drug-free competitors.
Right. Excellent. So thank you for that first statement from both of you guys. So I'll give the mic back to Mike. Jesus. So this was not planned, by the way. So what I want to ask you, Mike, is do you see any kind of specific issue with going for long? So maybe even 7, 8 or more months of gaining continuously before you eventually dip into a deficit to clean up some of that mess you made?
So I do see some advantages and disadvantages to very long term, and by that I will define personally as 4-month plus uninterrupted surplus conditions nutritionally, and the concordant training required to benefit from those. There are some plus sides and there are some downsides. One of the plus sides is that tracking your body weight, especially if you're into doing weekly averages and you're not gaining much at any one time, becomes much easier in the sense that it becomes more dependable. A lot of the first weeks, plural, of a mini cut or a bulk is a lot of water weight, water compartment movement, and it really blurs the picture of what the hell's going on. But if you gain for longer than 4 months, you start to get a very, very dependable morning, evening body weight, and you can really start to track proxy tissue rate gains much closer to scale weights. Another big advantage, I think, of longer bulking phases is the concept of momentum. And I think that concept very likely has physiological reality in the human body as regards to muscle gain. This is one of the reasons why I'm against, in most cases, bulking phases that last less than 2 months. Because I think that, I've used this analogy before, I think the construction of muscle tissue is much more akin to the construction of a skyscraper than it is to piling sand on a big sand pile. For example, if you don't weave the elevator shaft through the next floor, through floor 77, there's no physical way to get certain materials that require an elevator versus the stairs up to floor 78. So until you have all electrical, all wiring installed, and the elevator functioning to get to 78, you can't really start floor 78. So there has to be a certain amount of completion of these macro structures that are not simply the size of a brick, entire floors. And I think entire floors, so to speak, in muscle terms, take a while to be constructed. It is not a matter of days. I think it is longer. So, for example, if you're truly looking to construct muscle, I think a lot of times it's a very good conceptual understanding, but I think it falls a little short, where people say it's just a matter of higher fractional synthetic rates than fractional breakdown rates. Well, yeah, with sand in a pile analogy, totally. Thing is, in muscle, you're building entire complex systems. A sarcomere is a functional complex system. It does not take, a couple of seconds to build. It probably doesn't take a day to build, and it doesn't take a day to integrate into an already extant myofibril. So I think satellite cell sort of infiltration also takes a while. And I think a lot of these are probably momentum-based, where your body, remember from an evolutionary perspective, especially as you get more advanced, it's not a really big fan of building muscle. And it needs quite a bit of convincing that you're going to be building this muscle in a more permanent state. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I got some weird feedback. I don't want to do the robot voice like meh, 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 meh. So I think it's potentially a good thing to mass for longer, to bulk for longer, because I think that really gives the body a huge, or gives the physiology kind of a momentum where the muscle building process occurs for so long that it just, in analogical terms, your body's like, all right, whatever, clearly you want this muscle, we'll put it on and we'll keep it. But I think, to use an extreme example, if you bulk for like a week and then you start cutting, never mind the fact that you're not going to be able to, really know if you're at a surplus, really know anything, your body's much, much more likely to jettison any kind of structures it adds for a very short time than the ones it adds for a long time. And the myonuclear domain sealing plays really well into this, right? So if you, after a while, don't expand your satellite cell pool or the actual use of satellite cells integrated into the muscle, it doesn't matter how much muscle you put on within the myonuclear domain. If you don't add any new satellite cells, that muscle just goes away pretty fast, and it just goes away with your diet. But if you add satellite cells, it's really good. And I think the process of adding satellite cells, et cetera, in any meaningful number probably takes months, plural. So in the high-level coaches, individuals I've talked to about this, I really do think there is something to momentum. Oh, that was loud as hell. Was that on my end? Sorry, my computer's yelling at me. Thanks, computer. So on the other end, so there's definitely a plus side to longer masses in that regard. On the other hand, I think that hypertrophy training itself is an auto-extinguishing phenomenon, that if you continuously tap into the pathways, the anabolic pathways that allow for hypertrophy training to occur, then they, like all pathways with negative feedback loops, become less and less sensitive. There's also a nutritional desensitization that occurs. As you get to higher and higher body fats, your insulin sensitivity goes down. Probably your sensitivity to anabolizing muscle tissue goes down as well. And if you go slower, this of course helps the nutritional side because you're not getting as fat as fast. But I think if you go slower, it's one of these things where it only attends to the nutritional side, but on the training side, I think we still have a problem. So basically, my biggest concern with a massing phase that lasts 4 months plus, let's say 4 to 6 months, is that after month number 4, I think it's time for a lower volume training phase to resensitize the body to grow again at higher volumes. And as the principle of overload demands, we progressively present higher and higher volumes, progressively higher and higher relative intensities, progressively make use of more advanced techniques such as metabolites or BFR or whatever. I think at about month 4, you run out of shit to do. That is, no longer you can present a superlative stimulus, And it has been shown in empirical evidence from my reading of the literature that catabolic activity with prolonged higher volumes starts to rise to the level of anabolic activity. So at first, when you train in the first week, you get a really big anabolic response, but the catabolic concomitant response is relatively low. As you train for weeks and weeks and weeks and longer, the amount of catabolic activity starts to relatively equal the amount of anabolic activity. It eventually supersedes it when you enter a situation of overreaching. I think after a while, you have nothing more to give from the overload perspective that will be anything less than overreaching. And I think at that point, you have to shut it down, come back to lower volumes, essentially take what I call a resensitization phase or a maintenance phase, train just enough to keep your muscle around, potentially timing that with a mini cut, which I think is smart, and letting the body cool off for a bit, and then making another run at the process. I think if you're training for much longer than 4 months consecutively in hypertrophy training, I don't think that hypertrophy training, especially for more advanced individuals, is going to become as effectual as it could be, possibly in extreme cases completely non-effectual. And I think it's pertinent to come back around and go back and reset some things. It's kind of like an analogy could be made for training at the mesocycle level. If you want to train for 12 weeks without a deload, either you're training way too easy to maximize outcomes, or you're overreaching, possibly overtraining towards the latter half. But if you deload every 5 or 6 microcycles, every 5 or 6 weeks, then you can both stay in an intelligent and appropriately voluminous and intense sort of stimulus the entire time, but also when the time comes, you back off, you let everything reset, and you go at it again. So those are my thoughts, briefly summarized. Briefly, LOL.
Right. Okay. So thank you, Mike. That was great. And so I could I'm making notes in the meanwhile here, and I identified a couple points of contention so far. So let's try to go in order with these. So Mike touched on the fact that long-term hypertrophy training, I mean, this is more of a nutrition-focused podcast now, but hypertrophy training in the long term presents some sort of anabolic resistance that develops over time. And the other thing was the body fat aspect of all of this, that at higher body fat percentages, you're less responsive to gaining muscle. So first, if you want to briefly touch on these 2 points, Eric.
Certainly. Yeah, and they're good points. So I think the first one that Mike brought up is that at higher body fat levels, we typically see dampening of anabolic signaling. And there's actually a pretty good recent paper that came out that looked at individuals of different body fat levels and their response to protein feeding. And it did indeed show this. But I think there's a couple really important things to point out about that paper is one, that the quote unquote normal people in that paper were still around like 20% body fat for males, which means that what is considered a level of body fat where it provides anabolic resistance is probably a lot higher than where most bodybuilders hang out in the off season. That's not to say there aren't some bodybuilders who get up into the 20% body fat range as males, the equivalent being, 28 to 30% in a female. But it's probably not the norm. The second really important thing to point out about that study is that they weren't exercising. And training creates a whole lot of beneficial effects in muscle that keeps it pretty sensitive. You're basically putting in and removing substrates all the time. And when you really look at some of the types of ways that our body gets resistant to substrates, like insulin, in the case of diabetes and things like that, a lot of it comes from an overload of that substrate without ever being able to clear it out, and the body having to do some crazy acrobatics, like trying to make itself resistant to the hormone that actually will put more substrate into it to try to deal with this, and then you get this cascade of effects that we have identified as type 2 diabetes. While I don't have direct data comparing trained individuals to untrained individuals, we do have some pretty cool observational data when we look at super heavyweight weightlifters, super heavyweight powerlifters, and some bodybuilders in the off season, that I'm not too convinced that in those individuals who do push above 20% body fat, and sometimes substantially higher, that you can't make decent progress, at least in a practical realm, where you do see weightlifters and powerlifters getting stronger in the super heavies. And you do see bodybuilders who seem to make improvement season to season, even though they kind of go on the, Lee Priest bulk. Obviously, that's going to be confounded by a lot of other variables, but I think it's an interesting observation nonetheless. So the first thing I would say is that this is probably only a concern at pretty damn high body fat levels for a bodybuilder. And it may not be as much of a concern if you're doing resistance training, which I would really hope any bodybuilder trying to put on muscle mass would be lifting weights, or they've really got some things wrong and they need to kind of go back to the drawing board before even listening to this podcast. Now, as far as training, I very much agree with Mike. And I think there's a very strong argument for a lot of different reasons, both practical and mechanistic, as to why you'd want to have some level of let's call it periodization, where you have periods of high volume, high overload stimulus, periods of deloads, periods where I might call it transition block, where you're, like Mike said, you're not really trying to push it, you're trying to recover, both mentally and physically. And I think that serves the purpose of resensitizing everything. Periods where you might be using higher loads, lower volumes, where you're testing. I think all of those different phases have a time and a place, and they work nicely with an appropriate surplus. Many of the athletes I work with, and this is I think an important note, is that I don't have them necessarily tracking calories in the off season. I'm normally looking at the output and then ensuring all the boxes are ticked so that we know that an appropriate environment is there. So, for example, during prep, they may be tracking all 3 macronutrients because we have a very specific goal, and we need to be highly specific in our measurements. But when we're looking to gain what is very difficult to measure, let's say a pound a month, I'm more so looking at 2 or 3 week trends in body weight, encouraging them to eat till they're feeling slightly more than satiated, and then making sure that protein is in place and adequate carbohydrate intake, etc. But we're a little looser with the tracking, and we're more so relying on the habits they've developed as being an experienced bodybuilder. And what that often does is that satiety plays some role relative to the amount of energy expenditure they're doing. So during a phase where they're in a high volume, high overload phase, they're to be seeing the kind of weight gain we want, they're going to be eating a higher caloric intake naturally. And it might fluctuate on the days, but it's going to, in my experience, with a experienced athlete who's actually gotten away from tracking all the time and just living by the numbers, if you will, and we're just following a very rigid meal plan, but using a bit more of their intuition and bringing in the qualities of hunger and satiety, and kind of letting that modulate their surplus, and then also looking at the output, the weight gain, and modulating that back again. So kind of feeding back into the system, going, right, maybe I should be a little more full, or a little less full at the end of my meals to ensure I'm gaining at the right rate. This coincides nicely with whatever periodization model you're using. So when you go into that maintenance phase, the calories come down, so the surplus doesn't get too high. So it kind of keeps it auto-regulated, if you will, the surplus with the total training load, which I find works quite well. And it prevents you from putting on body fat too quickly, which is kind of what would get you to that first place. So with a slower gaining phase, with a slower rate of gaining, you're less likely to have your body fat get as high, to have to deal with that theoretical, although unlikely situation where a higher body fat is going to cause a problem, in my experience. But I do totally agree that you're going to need to have cycles where you are not trying to push overload, and you're not trying to, stimulate hypertrophy as much because you're trying to recover. And it probably doesn't make sense for, let's say you ran a 1 month transition cycle. If you're running a 1 week deload, I normally don't think it's worth manipulating your nutrition much, just kind of auto-regulate it, because of what's going to happen in a week anyway, especially when you're trying to gain a pound a month. But if you're going to go through one of those longer blocks, like Dr. Israetel mentioned, where you're going to have like a transition block, that is probably a situation where you would not want to be in much of a surplus, if at all, during that period. You probably wouldn't want to be in a deficit either, in my opinion, if that is a recovery block. But just kind of eating closer to maintenance calories and more, with a less aggressive surplus at least, is probably a good idea. So I would agree there.
Right. Excellent. So there are a couple of very interesting points to touch on here. One is still the magnitude of caloric surplus, which I definitely want to dig into in a second. But just to put a kind of, not a final point, because this question will always keep coming up in the future, but this question of body fat percentages and sort of what are the optimal ranges to aim at to have optimal nutrient partitioning. Eric, you mentioned that you're not so confident in this 15% as the upper limit for muscle gaining. I want to address this question to both of you. Are you aware of any kind of literature or study that would indicate that, for example, you have a worse nutrient partitioning at, say, 15% body fat than what you have at 11% body fat? Because this is not really a trivial question, in the sense that a lot of people fear this 15% upper limit so much that they are of the belief that they have to get to 8% body fat before they even start gaining muscle. So what do you guys think about this? And I'd like both of you to chime in if you care.
That works. Mike's over there probably already answering the question. But I think practically this is something to think about. But mechanistically and at the physiological level, again, this comes down to the fact that you're not sedentary. This doesn't hold a lot of water until you get pretty extreme. The original idea is what's called Forbes theory, and it's based on, I would not say strong experimental research in resistance trained athletes. The idea that the whole P ratio idea, and I think it's a very useful conversation, but it doesn't work great both ways. And I can tell you that if you are a drug-free bodybuilder and you've just gotten yourself down to, say, 5 or 6% body fat for a male, or 9 to 10% body fat for a female, your body is ready to put on body fat. It may also be ready to regain the lost muscle that happened during that season, if you did indeed lose any, which seems to be much more likely in males, but that's another topic. Regain of lost muscle, certainly. Regain of lost or depleted glycogen stores and the appearance of fullness, and you feeling better and seeing, much better energy in the gym and being able to very soon put on a lot of lost muscle and look better. Yes. But are you actually going to start gaining new muscle tissue because you're lean? Absolutely not. If anything, you're in a position where body fat storage is more likely when you're very, very lean, unless you're naturally lean. That's kind of, your settling range. But if you've just dieted a long period of time, especially down to single-digit body fat percentages for males, I actually don't think you're in a better position to put on more muscle. It may give you a larger buffer of time before you have gotten unhappy with what you see in the mirror and allow for a more aggressive or longer bulk. But I don't necessarily think that was needed or necessary. I think really what it comes down to, because as I said, there are super heavyweights who have no problem getting stronger. What it comes down to is what's practical for your goals. So if you're a competitive bodybuilder and you're taking a 1-year off season, that gives you a little more leeway than if you're going to be competing again 6 months later. If you have a year and a half before you're going to start your next diet for the stage, you can get reasonably high in body fat before you have to start thinking about maybe a mini cut or a maintenance phase before then, ramping your calories back up and then dieting. You have to think about kind of the long-term planning. So when I work with athletes, I might not want them to get above 15 or 16% body fat for a male, purely for the fact that it's going to extend our diet. And we might end up losing muscle on the back end, or just not being able to do all the shows we want. And it comes down to really finding a sustainable body fat percentage for the off season, where behaviorally and in terms of psychological stress, food focus, and also just how hungry or not they are in the off season, they can maintain. And we basically want to maintain the lowest body fat percentage we can while not being food focused, while still feeling like sleep quality is there, libido is normal, and everything's functioning the way it should be, and you can train effectively, your joints don't feel achy, etc. But this is a pretty wide range. I've worked with males anywhere in the range of a legit 10% up to 20%. And I think the arbitrary number of 15% is probably not helpful. And like you said, there's many individuals who I think that data does not, or that recommendation is harmful to them, or they think they have to get lean before they can bulk. And in most cases, the individuals who do that, not to sound like I'm blaming the victim here or anything like that, but I think they're already coming from a background where they're uncomfortable with body fat gain. They want to be leaner. They don't like what they see in the mirror. And they're looking for information to justify what they would probably do anyway. They want to have a quote-unquote science-based reason to get lean, so that they're more comfortable with the idea of putting on body fat, because then they know it won't be as bad for going from 8 to 12% versus going from 12 to 15%. But I think it's a smokescreen that they're giving to themselves, that this is somehow optimal, and they're just filtering whichever information already fits their biases.
Right. So just before I give back the mic to Dr. Israetel, just to make this even more controversial, would you say that a guy, if he is not competing anytime soon, would be just as effective in his muscle gaining pursuits if he was to undulate between a body fat percentage of 10% and 15%, as if he was to do so between 15% and 20%? Like, would you say, Eric, that there's no practical difference between the two in terms of efficacy?
I would say on average, I don't think there would be a practical difference. There may be some individuals where that would be different. So I think that whole your mileage may vary thing, because, there's just such a wide diversity between individuals. But on average, I don't think there'd be any difference. And if you look at what is considered a quote unquote healthy body fat percentage, like I said, even in sedentary individuals, when you're up around 20% body fat, there's no anabolic resistance that we can see in a sedentary person in response to feeding. So I highly doubt that would cause any mechanistic physiological difference in response to training or nutrition with the goal of gaining mass. But I do think that if you're hanging around 20% body fat and you're trying to go through a massing phase, you're not going to like what you see, and psychologically it's going to bother you. Going from 20 to, let's say you did a really good job, like Mike said, you're doing 50-50 muscle and to body fat, and you put on a good chunk of muscle, over a 4-month period. You might go from 20 to either 21 or 22% body fat, and you put on a good amount of muscle, but you might not look that much better. In fact, you might feel like you look a little bit worse.
Yeah.
Because you're already starting from such a high body fat percentage. Unless you just distribute it really well, or, you gained a disproportionate amount of muscle in your delts and your lats, so you looked wider and better in a shirt. But if you kind of gained it more evenly, it's you're not really going to like what you're seeing. But when you go from, 12 to say, or 10 to say 15% body fat, you're maintaining enough of, the illusion of more size because you're leaner, at least when your shirt's off. And I think, you'll still have some veins in your arm when you train, and you'll see, the outline of a 4-pack. For a male, I think, and for a female as well, just, different markers for what that looks like. It's going to be a little more motivating when you're a little bit leaner. But you just have to watch and not let that get out of control. So the short answer to your question, because I've given you a roundabout one, is physiologically probably not going to be any difference. Psychologically, I can easily see how a lot of people would not want to be pushing into the low 20s or the low 30s if you're a female, even if there wouldn't be a difference. Like if we actually just put you on a DEXA and looked at how much lean mass changed, because visually the addition of body fat at that level is not going to be something that most people are comfortable with if they consider themselves recreational lifters or bodybuilders who are doing this to improve their appearance.
Excellent. So, Dr. Israetel, now I will give the mic back to you. So if you're still there, what did you think of what Eric just said about body fat percentages and their optimality for muscle building?
Yeah, well, let me just state, I don't think much of him at all. I don't think much of Eric either.
Yes, finally. I've been waiting for this, but finally.
Okay, but before I get into that, Eric, has anyone ever told you that on the phone / speaker you sound almost exactly like Captain America?
No, that's a first. I've been told I look like Chris Evans, but sounding like him?
Yeah.
It's a first.
Yeah, I also heard that he looks like it, but yeah, I don't really know how he sounds, so.
Oh, man, I'm telling you. In your room, it is everywhere. Everywhere you step, there's anabolic resistance. And that, if you're truly interested in your best outcomes, which sometimes your best outcomes at a high enough level are any outcomes at all that are beneficial, that you may have to attend to the very finer points, such as keeping your body fat as low as possible without getting into the diet fatigue situation that Eric very well described, but at the same time not getting so high that you sort of get any of this extra body fat anabolic resistance sort of situation. So I think for individuals that are advanced, between 10 and 50% body fat, I think anything much in excess of 15% body fat, I think may be fine, but is not guaranteed enough to be fine for my tastes. I think that for most individuals, anywhere between 10 and 20% body fat is A-okay to run through and train, which is actually one of my key recommendations when individuals ask me, hey, I just started lifting, should I cut or mass. I actually say neither. Just maintain, eat well, because you don't know how to eat probably yet. Just eat good whole foods and plenty of protein for about a year. You'll just recomp to an exceptional degree. And then wherever you recomp, wherever you end up genetically, if you're on the leaner side, you can start massing or bulking. If you're on the fatter side, you can start mini cutting or whatever to continue to bulk. So I think that 10 to I very, very much agree with Eric that the 10 to 15% landmarks become a focus of extant neuroses for people that already have them. And they say, I DEXA at 15.1. Does that mean I gained 0.1 just pure fat? I'm like, no, it's not that you just gained pure fat. Is that you gained a moral negligence that will always be forever with you and will tar everything you ever do and say. It's much worse than you think, right? And they're like, oh, fuck, I knew it. Yeah, I'm just telling you what you already know, but you're going to hell. So I think that paranoia about saying between 10 to 15% applies almost never to beginners, somewhat to intermediates, but not a big deal. I think to the advanced, they had better keep between, 15-ish. If you go to 16, 17, who gives a shit? But if you're like chronically between, 17 and 21% body fat, I think that if you're advanced, you could do better by staying a little leaner. There's another situation or another sort of constraint that may encourage staying on the leaner end, and that is the really high amount of negatives with a prolonged calorie deficit to get back into contest shape. So if you're a competitor, I think that if you're north of 20%, you look down the pipe at your next show, which is a year and a half away, and you're like, well, this is going to suck 80 dicks at the same time, which, depending on which way you feel about that, could be great. But whatever, poison dicks that shoot fire, bad things. Bad things, folks. I forgot not everyone thinks dicks are bad. Here I go again. So basically, it's a tough road to hoe, and going from a super high body fat down to contest condition. Now, of course, you would take it slowly. Of course, you would take it incrementally, and of course, you would give yourself the appropriate amount of time. But sheer, time divided by deficit or time multiplied by deficit is going to be long, and it's going to cause a more profound magnitude of all these diet resistance factors, hormonal alterations, really gnarly psychological alterations, relationship with food, potential for strength loss, potential for muscle loss, etc. So I think one of the benefits of not getting much further than 20%, and for the more advanced, not further than 15-ish, is because you're always within shooting range of show condition, and that's not going to whoop your ass to get into. Some individuals like John Meadows, for example, he never really gets that fat. Fuck him. He has good genetics and really good dedication, has been doing this for like 1,000 years or something. But his show diet is like 8 or 9 weeks or something like that. And like, damn, that looks good. And then you see other people that have gotten to absurd levels of body fat, and they're like, all right, time to start prepping. And they just describe these horrendous things. Nick Shaw and I, when we did our first bodybuilding show, I think the sum total of the diet was something like 27 weeks of almost exclusively hypocaloric period. I basically had like a borderline eating disorder at the end of that process, something I never want to do again. And fundamentally is because we made an error. We were so far out of shape that we thought we could just one and gun the diet to the show. Clearly that was bad. But I think, insofar as athletes don't pay a big price for not exceeding 10%-ish, and of course there's a distribution to this, right? Some people for whom it takes heaven and earth to stay at even 15%, there's no way you'd push them down to 10, because then all of those dietary resistance factors would mean that they're not gaining a whole lot of anything except for fat and, maybe their sanity back after you get them down to 10. So for sure there's genetic, situations at play here. But I think for the average competitor, I think if you can keep them between 10 and 15%-ish, on a massing phase, 10 is high enough that you avoid most of these problems of immediate post-show kind of situations with hormonal issues and hunger and stuff. But 15-ish is as high as I would go to comfortably be within reach of another competition, because I'm not a huge fan of getting way out of shape and then cutting like crazy to get into shape and then doing it all over again. I'm not a huge fan of it because I've done it for so long and I've been burned so many times. Funny enough, I don't think that another piece of evidence that mass bulking phases at 15% plus are catastrophic I think to build Eric's point, I can offer myself as an example, and of one, of course, is a very limited piece of evidence, but I actually got up to right around 20-ish% body fat at 250 pounds, drug-free. That was the peak of my drug-free career. I'm still drug-free, right? So still kicking it, LOL. So, for the various governmental authorities clearly listening to these sorts of podcasts. But, I did that. My average body fat must have been around 22%. Some of my bulking phases took me damn near a 30. Now, was that a mistake to some extent? Marginally? Yes. Did I still put on I wrestled in the 103-pound weight class in high school, right? So did I put on a shitload of drug-free muscle anyway? Yeah, fuck yeah, I did, right? So I think that when people see this 15 as a top figure, it's just like if I was giving out advice to a competitor, I'd be like, yeah, I don't want you to get much fatter than 15. But to a recreational person that's naturally pretty lean, they're like, should I bulk to 20%? My advice wouldn't be like, dude, you fucking idiot. You're just going to die and you're going to get super fat forever. And again, the moral implications of going above 15%, right? You can't go to funerals or be at church anymore because you're the devil. So I wouldn't say that. I would just be like, man, that's okay. And they'd be like, well, what's optimal? And I'd say, probably don't get too much above 15%. I think you're fine. And they're like, how much are we talking about difference here? And I'd be like, I really don't think we're talking about much, a huge difference at all. Just another concern, really quick, and this is a very small concern, staying between 10-15%, or I could just jettison those numbers altogether, staying on the leaner side can allow you to monitor progress visually. To see if what you're doing is sort of working. Now, there's, of course, numerical progress, like are you getting stronger at certain exercises? But I think a lot of individuals who do the super bulk, and this is, of course, not something Eric's supporting, but just, because a lot of folks will be listening to this and some may interpret what we have said as, super bulk is great. Just, what is that called? Dreamer bulk or whatever from the internet.
Bulking.
Sometimes you think that bulking, just fuck it all. I'm just going to eat peanut butter out of a straw and liquefied, but it doesn't sound that bad. So, that kind of thing is you may very well have thought that you were bringing up your legs, but it turns out whatever combination of training and nutritional approaches you were taking didn't hypertrophy your legs much, but you had no idea because your legs were covered by so much body fat, you didn't know what the fuck's going on. So I think a very small element of there is to be able to track visual changes. And lastly, I think even for the recreational lifter, there has to be a question asked of why are you recreationally lifting? And I think not all, but many answers will be, I want to look fucking jacked. I want to look good. I want to look better and better. So I know I have to make trade-offs of body fat to put on muscle in the long term, but I don't want to spend too much time away from at least looking like I lift and people not just thinking I'm just some overweight person. So I think there's another argument there from the psychological side, which is important. Like, if someone can realistically go from 10 to 15%, it does not impact their hormonal status. It's not fucking up anything on the too lean end. I think it's potentially a good thing for them to stay in that range because then they at least look like they lift most of the time, which is like goal number one. I would hate to tell someone to get radically out of shape and then back in shape and have them for 4-week period look like they want to look and then go back to being a fat piece of shit, etc. So those are my thoughts.
Excellent. That was great, Mike. And so we heard a couple of things. So for one, there is the psychological considerations. So people just generally like to be pleased with what they see in the mirror, and that can be encouraging to keep training hard, to keep being on point with your diet. The other thing is the visual assessment thing. Like both of you kind of touched on this. After some point, it kind of becomes just hard to assess whether you put on muscle, whether you just put on more fat. And then also there might be some potential physiological downsides to getting over a certain body fat percentage. But, Mike, if I understood you correctly, you kind of said that this is more of a concern to more advanced individuals. So if we are talking to the kind of intermediate-ish lifter, who is probably the majority of the people listening to this, for them who are not competing anytime soon, or maybe don't even plan to compete at all, they just want to look like they lift, would it be a good kind of general advice to give them to generally, if they can tolerate it, be at the lower side or leaner side, but generally just try to aim at a place where they feel good, have good energy levels, and are still not too unsatisfied with their body fat percentages? Would that be a general good recommendation? Mike, you can go first since you unmuted yourself.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that's just fine, and I wouldn't. I would belabor the point of staying on the leaner end inversely for beginners and intermediates, like being like, don't you worry about being lean. You need to get jacked. So as long as you're not over 25%, I think you're good to go. As they begun to become intermediates, I would say as long as you're not over 20%, I think you're good to go. As they become highly advanced, I would then say that, if you get over 15%, it's not the end of the world, but I would just try to stick between 10 and 15. So I think there's definitely different levels of advice for levels of individual in their involvement in sport. I think that's actually a good point to make in general, which Eric will likely agree with. Sorry, Dr. Helms. Eric, stop calling me Dr. Israel. For God's sake. Call me Mike. Doesn't that shit cancel out when you're both PhDs, right? It's like, what I'm saying, we're all back to first names, which, by the way, is weird to do with your principal investigator that gave you a PhD. Like, all of a sudden, he becomes just like Josh, and you're like, no, absolutely not. Dr. Garnett, I'm never going to call you Josh. That's ridiculous. So anyway, I think a good piece of advice is for those individuals looking for recommendations on the internet as far as lifting and dieting, etc., training age is a big factor. And is one of the key stumbling blocks to people looking at what pro bodybuilders do, for example, and trying to copy it. And that's drug-free or not, because they're clearly at the advanced stage and they're just going to be doing some very, very different things. So I think it's always pertinent to consider developmental age, even when giving body fat ranges that are realistic versus optimal, et cetera.
Right. Eric, anything to add to this that we didn't belabor so far?
I don't belabor a few more things. I think I'm very much on the same page with Mike with everything you just said, and that extends across all sports. The recommendations you give to a beginner, intermediate, or advanced are going to be different and should be different. I think the only minor point of contention is one that ends up with the same practical outcome. I'm not necessarily convinced that there are physiological reasons why someone with more muscle mass and more training age under their belt shouldn't be getting at a higher body fat percentage, or not higher, but that 15% is the cutoff. But I think practically, look, you've got maybe another 5 pounds left you can put on your body ever before you start having, age-related declines and you just can't train the way you want. So why are we pushing up to, 15, 16, 17%? And for God's sake, man or woman, you've been lifting for 15 years and going through this whole competing process. This is your 40th show. Don't you think you should have a better relationship with food where you don't have to get up into, like low scale obesity levels of body fat? I think that's probably the reason why I would be like, why don't we stay a little tighter? It's going to make your diet easier. And, this shouldn't be a problem for you. And there's no purpose to be pushing these big surpluses or long massing phases, because we just can't do that much in a single off season or even 2 off seasons. So I think practically that becomes the same outcome, although I'm a little less convinced of the physiology there. And then just to belabor the point of not worrying too much about your body fat levels if you are actually training and active is, the athletes on the planet that have the highest level of lean body mass ever recorded are sumo wrestlers. So it's certainly not like they turn into Jabba the Hutt and just because they have anabolic resistance. And I think that's just something to point out that, activity is a very powerful modulator of nutrient partitioning. And I think probably more so than the body fat percentage you're at.
Right. Excellent. I think we are largely in agreement here, all of us. The two of you. So I think we could, of course, try to distill down a bit even more. But there's something else I definitely want to touch on briefly is, Mike, I'll turn back to you for a second just to give your general rationale for pushing calories a little bit more aggressively. Because if you're doing one of these longer extended gaining phases that Eric goes for sometimes with his clients, and even with yourself, Eric, as far as I know, where you may be in a gaining phase for, 7, 8, 9 months, then necessarily your caloric surplus will be lower. So you can't really go for a 500 caloric surplus day to day. So what would be the general issue from your end, Mike, with being more modest with the caloric surplus and just taking it real slow, if there's any?
Oh, cool. So you're asking what my issue would be if I was with a very modest surplus?
Yeah, when you're gaining maybe like 1 pound a month.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very difficult for me to conceive how you can track 1 pound a month. I think you get in a situation where you can piss away 2 months comfortably due to humidity changes, due to climate, and your body's proclivity to store water and not know. So you could be mildly hypocaloric or easily eucaloric, isocaloric for a month or two if you're gaining a pound per month, and just be none the wiser. I think unless you're weighing yourself at a university laboratory scale, I think most scales tend to have, the company promise doesn't extend much beyond a couple decimal places or much beyond, 1 decimal place. And I think even if you're doing very long-term intensive tracking, just the differences in average food choice that you're not even tracking can blur the lines. So, for example, if you just got into the habit lately to go with your girlfriend for Chinese food, and this lately happens to be month 2 of your diet in which you're going to be putting on weight, it can look like in the second part of your diet, month 2, your averages are up, but it turns out because you're eating significantly more sodium just by accident, just because you got into this Chinese fix for your free meals or cheat meals or what have you, putting in your macros, that you have this illusory interpretation. And then month 3, you're kind of like, I'm sick of Chinese, and you start going for sushi, and you don't like soy sauce much, and so it's a lot of like lean meats and stuff, and you lose 2 pounds average scale weight, and you're like, holy shit, I ain't gaining anything, right? So that's my concern there. Another concern, not so much concern, but I think there's the potential to miss out on some gains. I think fundamentally body fat, especially for short-term diets, something like 3 to 6 weeks of mini cutting, so to speak. I think especially taking the myonuclear domain stuff into account, body fat is relatively easy to drop off, a lot of it pretty quickly, without seriously endangering long-term muscle mass accretion, and certainly without dipping your muscle settling point down. On the other hand, muscle gains, especially for the advanced athlete, are quite hard. And so I think you need more of a superlative effort to push along muscle gain with a higher surplus, giving the body an unequivocal message for anabolism. By the way, a higher surplus, is basically more insulin secretion is involved, and all the messaging systems that detect surpluses are definitely on and sort of maxed out, making sure you can put on the most muscle that you can per any 1 unit time. And because fat is so easy to get rid of after that, as long as it's not an involved months-long diet in which you can really risk muscle loss, although still probably can't risk myonuclear domain issues, I think that turns into a situation of why not err a little bit on the side of more, definitely not run into tracking problems, definitely get all the muscle I have coming my way over the next several months. And then if I end up being a little bit too fat, which is really the only downside, that's a matter of 4 weeks of mini cutting away, and I'm boom, back to square one with my body fat. No metabolic adaptation to that. Mini cutting, if anything, it just makes you a little bit hungrier, more ready to go, makes you a little bit more sensitive to muscle gain. And I think at that point, you're the best of both worlds. Whereas if you gain intentionally very slowly, then you could be missing out on some of that stuff and just simply not gaining as much muscle over the long term as you otherwise could be. Those are my, I think, most of my fundamental concerns for that sort of thing.
Excellent. So Eric, couple of points we've heard. So issue of tracking, providing all the anabolic stimulus, and I guess I will add, you can also eat a hell of a lot of food, and you can just be back at square one after a couple of months. So this seems like one hell of a proposal. What do you think of these points?
I think they're good points, and they're definitely ones I've considered. One thing I've come to realize looking at the literature and watching interesting study designs like the stuff out of Jose Antonio's lab, where they fed, one group a shit ton of protein, close to 2 grams per pound, and saw very little weight gain, but still some muscle gain in these advanced, I should say resistance trained individuals, which is not a great proxy for like an elite level bodybuilder by any means. And just all the studies where we don't enforce a caloric surplus, but we do institute a resistance training protocol, and you see body recomp or weight gain happen almost every time, just as a kind of a natural change in the energy balance of the person subconsciously, is that I'm not that concerned when you take a slow bulking approach if you dip in and out of being slightly hypocaloric, because being hypocaloric isn't like an on or off switch, even though it's difficult to talk about it and not present it that way. And I think I'm guilty of that as well. Being in a 50 or 100 calorie surplus on a Wednesday, when your goal is to be in a net 100 or 200 calorie surplus, I really don't think is going to pull much away from what's happening with you, especially when you're not super, super lean. I don't think there's going to be a huge difference in the ability to gain muscle, believe it or not, especially at a more advanced stage where you're only going to gain so much anyway. I think Mike mentioned this earlier, that having anything happen for an advanced lifter in terms of muscle gain is pretty successful. If you're putting on muscle, you're doing something right. And I think what bulking actually looks like in terms of the rates of gain, and what a recomposition looks like in terms of the rates of muscle gain in a advanced lifter are almost indistinguishable. So I'm just not necessarily convinced that a higher surplus, while it does from a signaling perspective, it basically ticks every single box. It makes sure that you're absolutely doing everything you can to gain muscle. I don't know that it actually results in any faster muscle gain. And I don't know that I have, and I've definitely tried both. Like, like Mike, I've been lifting for 14 years, and probably after year 2 or 3, I found that the whole intentional surplus, for a short period of time and gaining, a pound a week really only served to make me fat. And I noticed the same parallel with almost all of my clients. So this came kind of from an experiential starting place, and then I started to look at data and the research, and there's not a great data set, but what we do have does kind of seem to indicate that the trained individuals, there is kind of a speed limit there. And while I think I do agree with Mike's approach, the only downside I see to it, because I think, yeah, sure, if you want to, maybe you're gaining some unmeasurable amount of additional muscle when you've just got every single signal in the body pointed towards anabolism. You're training hard, you're eating a lot, insulin's there, everything he said, sure, I totally agree. And he's right. It isn't that hard to drop body fat. You take a month and a half and go into a reasonably aggressive deficit, you're at a high enough body fat percentage where you're not going to lose anything in terms of muscle mass. Probably hitting pause at worst, and you drop a lot and you rinse and repeat. I think the only downside to that is that I have found it sometimes, when on the psychological side with athletes who, competitive bodybuilders specifically, or physique athletes in general, who don't have a great relationship with food, I've found that they're really good at cutting, very good at bulking, but they don't really know how to eat closer to maintenance, and they don't have a great grasp of just reasonable eating like an adult, hashtag, if you will, kind of nonsense, but you know what I mean when I say that, like eating like a reasonable human, being able to control intake, not cut, not bulk. That is something that is surprisingly absent in many even very high level competitors. I've worked with multiple people who are placing, let's say, top 3 at world championship level bodybuilding competitions, who they essentially just slowly slide into uncontrolled overeating in the off season, and their solution to that is, I'm going to compete again. So they compete back-to-back years and do very well. And from the outside, you're thinking, oh, well, they're just really trying to push from third to second to first and just trying to make incremental progress, and they're going to be a world champion soon. The reality is that 6 months into their off season, they're really unhappy with the way they look in the mirror, partially because they're actually gained a lot of body fat, partially because they don't have a great relationship with their body image. And the only way they really know how to solve that is to then get back on stage. And so I think I've seen that enough, and that may be something that is maybe outside of this theoretical conversation, but I think it is a useful thing in terms of overall bodybuilding career development, your long-term relationship with the sport, to be able to learn how to eat at maintenance for an extended period, as I think there are useful phases of doing that. And one thing my colleague Alberto Nunez does with a lot of his athletes is he'll go into a purposeful multi-month maintenance phase prior to starting the diet, so the athlete can make sure they have a really good grasp on how to track, how to hold steady, and is ready psychologically to get into the diet itself. Now, that's probably unrelated to a lot of what we're talking about, but I think I just don't want to underemphasize how important the relationship with food and life is, because as much as we try to, look at food as just fuel, it's a huge confounder as far as competitive bodybuilders who have an overwhelmingly high amount of issues in this area compared to other athletes. And I think it's something that probably colors a lot of my decisions. That may be a large factor in the decisions I make around off-season eating. Oh, and then, there was one other point that Mike made that I didn't address, and I'm trying to remember what it was. The tracking issue. Because I'm not that concerned if you're in a slight surplus at times, the tracking is not a huge issue for me. Most of the time, practically, I'll just tell you how I do it, is I have someone tracking 3 or more days per week, morning weigh-ins, and then we're looking at averages, not of even a single week, but sometimes 2 or 3 week averages, which is, I would agree, if it's not quote unquote successful over a 3 week period, you don't know until those 3 weeks are up when you're trying to say gain, 3/4 of a pound or a pound in that time frame. But at the same time, the true metric is not whether or not, body weight change is something that should correlate with muscle gain, but it's not necessarily the same thing. There are going to be shifts in water, body fat, and muscle mass, and the end result on the scale should probably be around, a pound per month in this scenario we're talking about. But if it doesn't show up, it doesn't mean that your training was ineffectual. It doesn't mean that you haven't put on muscle or you're not doing things right. So it's something where, you need to look at longer time frames, and that means that your corrections are going to be slower, but you're going at a slower speed. It's kind of akin to, instead of going around with a motorboat, you've got a very large barge, and you're going to make a slow course correction, but that's fine because you're making that course correction slowly as well. So everything's kind of just moving at a different pace. That's my overall response to that. But I do think that it's a very reasonable approach that Mike takes with slightly more aggressive massing phases and more frequent mini cuts. And I think that's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I think largely the decision whether you would take a longer, slower approach like I'm suggesting or what Mike is doing would come down to what skills do you need to develop with your eating behaviors. If you simply cannot eat in a small surplus because you only know how to bulk or cut, maybe you should challenge yourself and see if you can take a slower approach. But if you have no issue there and, you're purely just at a state in your career where, I don't have any problem gaining, a pound every other week and then doing a mini cut and then I'm all good. I control how long my off season is. I could take a 2 or 3 year one if I wanted to, come back to the sport. It's all good. Then I think you can feel free to choose whichever strategy you want, as there's not a psychological or behavioral issue that might want to be addressed.
Excellent. Yeah, that was great, Eric. And I'm glad that you mentioned on the psychological side of things, because that just, again, illustrates how there's a difference between real life and what would happen in a lab setting, or the completely theoretical rationale for things. And I'd like to give the mic to Mike. I said it again. So, and I guess the point I would like you to react to, Mike, was Eric's, what Eric mentioned about not necessarily being a detrimental effect of potentially even being in a hypocaloric state at times during a gaining phase, even though on the net balance, you want to be in a surplus overall. And that the literature is not overly clear on the necessity of distinct, purposeful surpluses at all times for building muscle. What do you think about this, Mike? After a mic unmute.
Yeah, thanks. I think the advantage to that is, for some individuals, a psychological one. I think that another advantage is because you occasionally enter hypocaloric periods sort of by accident, you actually keep yourself a little bit more sensitive to muscle gain that way. So you're kind of doing internal several-day mini cuts, so to speak, or several-week mini cuts, pulsated with massing phases that are, of a similar time scale. So that's a good thing. For my own coaching experience with myself, I've seen sort of two related problems that I think steered me a little bit away into a more formal, slightly more aggressive, or I would say purposeful direction of nutritional and training inputs. Problem number one is individuals who you just tell them to eat and lift and everything will be fine. Their hunger levels sometimes inversely associate with their training volumes. So the more they train, the more they get sick after squatting, and or their sympathetic nervous system response goes up in association with high volume training, and then they're not as hungry and they lose a lot of weight. So precisely when you want them to eat more, autoregulatory speaking, they don't. And or any variation of you tell someone to eat, lift, and grow, and they eat and lift, but they don't grow much because they simply just don't enter hypercaloric phases by accident anymore, or never were prone to. Just people who are prone to being skinny, that you tell them, okay, just eat, do a good job, and you'll be big, and they just don't eat. I think for good eaters, I think Eric's advice is of that sort of scope is very sound, because they'll gain. You don't have to worry about them. I think that the same advice applies to very large individuals pushing their physiology to sort of the very depths of where it'll go. When I got anywhere north of 220 pounds, my default eating would be to stop eating for months on end if I could choose, because I was so sick of food I had no idea what to do with myself anymore. So the autoregulatory approach to eating when your body does not want to gain any more muscle, its hunger levels are just not down to nil, it won't give you the ability to gain much muscle. I think that if we're looking for truly elite performance for the advanced, we have to push our body with our external tools of, sort of willpower, and to do things that are not indicated that we want to do them, like eat more food than we want, train harder than we want, train easier than we want at times where low volume phases are necessitated. I think those kinds of forays into artificially imposed top-down structure are really the only things that are going to make us better. I think after a while of being at the very high level and clawing and scratching for a little bit of muscle you can, or the least bit of fat you can, your body doesn't want to lose fat anymore. It doesn't want to gain any more muscle. And you have to offer a top-down structure, a little bit more extremity to, first of all, guarantee that that's happening, and second of all, guide the person into saying, okay, look, this is 500 grams of carbs today. What do you feel like eating? I don't feel like eating today. Well, your body doesn't feel like being jacked. So, and to the extent that, high-level athletes still gain muscle if you just tell them to eat or whatever, I think on average they do, but if you scope in individual by individual, some individuals don't. And if we take higher developmental athletes, they don't gain any muscle. Just tell them to eat and train. That just no longer works. So I think for beginners, it's great advice. For most intermediates, it's great advice. For more and more advanced individuals that are really pushing the limits, there has to be a top-down implementation of all kinds of things, of nutritional status, of loading strategies. I don't think I've ever wanted to squat more than 400 pounds. It feels like shit. It feels like I'm dying. But I do it anyway because I know it's going to make me jacked. It's an intellectual exercise versus an autoregulatory exercise. And insofar as I've made forays of squatting above 400 pounds multiple times for extended periods of discomfort, I have bigger legs. So I think that, and I think Erica made a very good point, that for a lot of people who are too psychologically on the edge and have lost touch with food normalcy, I think those individuals are not candidates for my approach. So I guess I would say that if you're psychologically okay, and Eric said as much himself, I think, you're good to go, then I think it's a fine thing to do my more sort of rigid and purposeful approach. But if you want a more autoregulated, more smooth approach that takes a bit longer, I think that a real good candidate for that is individuals that may not be in a place where if you just tell them to eat a maintenance, they just start crying, which actually I've witnessed with several clients of coaches that have that work for RP, because as a company we coach like some number of billion people, a lot of them on other solar systems and stuff apparently, but still get the coupon codes, baby, still profit for Dr. Mike. But in any case, they pay us an alien money. We don't know what to do with it, but whatever. We're trying to be intergalactic. I don't even know what I'm saying anymore. No, just kidding. So we have the a lot of individuals have come to us to the idea of a lack of purposeful change of the scale. A lack of at least trying to get bigger or trying to get leaner, especially the latter, presents like a epistemic shock, right? They're like, hold on, I'm trying to improve myself. And we're like, yes. And for now, that means maintaining. And they don't know what that means. So for individuals like that, I would certainly, sort of weasel them into a very, very much more smooth approach. But for individuals that are high-level competitors or close, individuals that have the psychological or sort of dexterity to be able to be taken outside of homeostasis with purposeful intent, I think those individuals can potentially benefit from what I would just describe as a slightly larger, more purposeful forays from homeostatic activity than something like what Eric would recommend. And of course, these differences I just remind people, are very small. I'm tired of hearing online that I recommend like gaining 4 pounds a week or some stupid shit. And, it goes both ways with all of our sort of fans and haters. If you don't like a position, I think it's best practice to just, caricature that position as something absurd no one would believe, and then just critique that, because that way you can win a criticism and feel good about yourself, which fundamentally isn't bodybuilding all about feeling good about yourself on the internet. Mm-hmm. I posit that, gentlemen, and I leave you with that incredibly potent question.
And my response would be, as Mike just said, that he advises gaining 4 pounds a week. And that you have to stay at 5% body fat the whole time. I completely disagree, and that's stupid.
Right.
Excellent fight. And to just advance my point further for more controversy, I never liked Captain America. I think he basically doesn't have superpowers. By the way, I know you claim drug-free status. Captain America got his powers by taking highly advanced Nazi steroids.
I've been drug-free
since
1941, okay? So that's plenty of time to claim drug-free.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of federations would return you to drug-tested competition after 5 yeers or something, so you're good to go.
Yeah, by way more time than I need to be.
Oh, gentlemen, let's keep our calm here. Okay. So Eric, I think Mike's points were pretty straightforward. So, would you like to react to what he said about the difference between personality types and how you want to approach them with your method?
No, I largely agree, and I think he brought up kind of the whole. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he very much kind of took intuitive eating and just kind of being in homeostasis is hand in hand with auto-regulation of intake, and I think just to anyone who might hear my advice and it jives with them, and maybe jives with their personality, and they go, yeah, I just kind of want to take a more relaxed approach to nutrition or training. What I'm really saying is, you need to be tracking your body weight 3 to 5 times a week, and you need to be seeing that you're actually putting on the rates of body weight that I suggested. And it's what I'm not saying is just whatever, dude, just do maintenance and try to see gains in the gym. I think that is good advice for lower level lifters, like Mike said. But when I work with someone, I am looking to see that depending on their body size, on average, we'll just keep using this 1 pound a month rate of gain. And that does add up. When the year's not over and you've put on 10 pounds, that you're going to look substantially different. Ideally with a fair amount of muscle and not just 10 more pounds of body fat. But it does need to be intentional. It does need to be tracked. I like my data. And, when I'm doing this, I'm making sure that we're seeing progression in the gym, that we're either able to add reps or add load to the bar, that we may be increasing volume over time, in concert with ensuring that we are reaching that 1 pound a month, target. So it's not to say that it's just kind of like, just eat and train. It's all good. That's not, I don't want people to think that that's the approach I'm recommending. It does need to be measured. I'm just saying that, I'm less confident for drug-free lifters that aggressive approaches will be worth it. But mini cuts aren't that hard, like Mike said, so you can, easily strip away any excess fat that you've gained. So I think it's more of a personal preference, which approach you want to go with. But there are psychological reasons to use one or the other.
Yeah, and just I want to bring this up because I think Mike didn't mention this, that Mike, in your approach, you don't just have mini cuts and gaining phases. You also have these instituted maintenance phases in your approach. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Especially in the context of individuals, the primarily goal is to lose fat over a long period of time. I think that maintenance phases are critical for all of the reasons that Eric described and more. I think their biggest benefit is to psychology, but I think there's a lot of physiological things going on with hormones, et cetera, that make maintenance phases indispensable. Melissa Davis, one of my coworkers at Renaissance, wrote a really good article about maintenance phases, and it's on the RP blog, and I'll share it every now and again. I'll share it again soon, specifically targeting her coaching population, which is the female population, and it gives all of the really good things about doing a maintenance phase, both psychologically and physiologically, kind of tries to put it in the context of you're not just killing time. These are purposeful, good things that you're doing for your long-term betterment. And I think that one of the resistances to a maintenance phase for males and females is like, well, what the hell am I doing this for? I'm just treading water. If you want to be a productive individual at work, you don't see weekends as treading water. You see them as a sort of recreation, a rebirth, a reinvigoration of your productive capacity in the week. If you're a workaholic that has a poor relationship with work and grinds himself down all the time and then quits work for 6 months on end and ends up in a fishing village in Europe where, Abel, you might actually live currently. I'm sorry to impose my Americocentric view, but I think that sort of situation is one in which individuals run into a long time, and the idea of a maintenance phase in general strikes people as very odd, and I think it's incredibly important to do. It is part of my long-term periodization for bodybuilders, but it is even more a feature of people trying to lose fat over the long term, and it's something that is very difficult to not push on people, difficult to convince people of unless they really try to buy into it, because of that doubt in people's minds that they're just treading water, right? That's what they think. A lot of times we've got accumulated quite a few pretty funny questions from clients over the years, but some of the common questions about a maintenance phase is, okay, so how much fat will I lose during a maintenance phase? The answer is none. Like, how much muscle am I going to gain? Probably none. And they're like, but that's crazy. And they're like, okay, what's crazy is your desire to continue to see linearity and progress at all times and how much you attach your ego to that. And that's the crazy part. And we need to get rid of that part, or at least mute it a little bit, so that you can have a long-term health and long-term success. And the two are inexorably linked. Long-term psychological, we'd have a whole other podcast about this, but long-term psychological health, the relationship to body image, food, and essentially your own wellness is critical for long-term body composition goal success, both getting to where you want to be and maintaining it, and for sure to competitive success, because I've seen a lot of people over the years go hardcore too much, too fast, ignore all the signs, and then they burn out. They quit physique sport altogether or quit pursuing their body image goals. And a lot of them go on to write books that I would say philosophically disagreeable to me, at least in part, saying, the whole fitness industry is bullshit, and this whole idea of that you have to look a certain way is bullshit, and I'm totally done with trying to change my body. You should just love yourself for who you are, which I think is true, but then they say, and don't try to change yourself through a body composition perspective. That last part, I think if you do it right and with care, I think you can have the best of both worlds, but individuals tend to burn out and go way crazy the other way, and I think that's in part this kind of pretending that you're just psychosis, and that your temptation to always be doing something to go forward and forward and forward and forward, never resting, is grounded in science or in best practice, or somehow gives you some sort of achievement award for working hard. The achievement award goes for working intelligently, not just hard. So there's my rant for that one.
That was beautifully said. Eric, anything that this sparked in your mind?
Oh, just an adoration for the man that is Mike Israetel, and how well he said that and how much I agree.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, I am fully aware that I'm being abusive to your times. One last question that I want to ask, because it will be a lifetime of regret if I don't ask this. But do you tend to tweak someone's caloric surplus as to how much muscle you anticipate he can gain, not just in terms of training age, but everything in terms of how genetically you think they are blessed, how much stress do they have? So obviously, if someone's recovery is really poor, then they can handle less volume, can probably also gain less muscle. So do you take these things into account when setting up someone's caloric surplus? Eric, start with you because your mic is unmuted.
Easy answer. Yeah, definitely. There's going to be, like you said, a lot of things that go into the decision-making process, and my guessing, really, educated guess nonetheless, of how quickly I think they can effectively gain muscle mass without it being too much body fat. a lot of that's going to come from having worked with the person previously, and I'll err on the side of being conservative initially. But yes, all those things and more are worth considering with how quickly you want to gain muscle mass for sure.
Excellent. Dr. Israetel?
Yeah, they would. So agreed with Eric. I think that one small point I have to make is I'm not so sure, I'm not completely convinced that higher level, more advanced athletes that are now gaining less muscle should lower their rates of tissue gain, because I think when it would be logical to lower the rates of weight gain for advanced athletes, I think there's also some logic in providing more of that extremity of checking all those boxes, because without one box check, we may be talking about no muscle gains at all for these people. So I think you may just have to settle for shittier ratios of fat versus muscle while still having to push it as fast. I'm not sure about that. I can't tell what I think about that. I think evidence-wise, I don't think there's any good evidence one way or the other, but I can't tell conceptually which one of those is a good idea. I think no one's going to gain weight like beginners, so for sure you're going to ramp them the fastest. And as you get more advanced, you're going to go slower. But I think the degree of slowdown between intermediate to advanced / very advanced, there may be no slowdown, because if you slow it down enough, you just slow it down to where nothing happens. Those are my thoughts on that.
Right. Excellent. Well, Eric, want to react to this one last time about the pushing equally as fast, just to make sure, even if you're an advanced lifter, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Honestly, I feel like we've probably already ticked that box, and I would agree. We don't have good evidence either way to know whether that would provide. We have some evidence, but we don't have good evidence whether that would provide an advantage. I'll definitely concede it's possible that maybe if we could somehow construct a study where we looked at a 1 or 2 year period, and we only allowed elite level bodybuilders into the study and tried these two approaches, we could tease that out. But I think we probably, unfortunately, won't have a great answer to that question. But we can definitely do more research, and I'm hopefully going to be doing a study looking at something similar to this in the future, where we're looking at probably what would you describe as intermediate or resistance trained individuals, with a couple of years under the belt at least, and decent strength levels, and then looking at different rates of muscle gain in them and seeing if that changes anything over time. So hopefully we'll have some better data in the future, and we'll be able to fine tune our recommendations to help more people.
Excellent. So guys, thank you so much. This was excellent. It's impossible to conclude this whole thing, but I think, as usual, there were a lot more agreements than disagreements, as it usually turns out, which is nice to see. And I guess one thing that we can definitely universally agree on is that you should probably spend, if you're not overweight or any of those things, you should spend considerably more time during the year, probably 3, 4, 5 times more time gaining than cutting. So I don't think there's anybody who would disagree with that statement. So my last question is, what kind of resources would you like people to check out? And then we will make sure to link to all of those. Eric, since your mic is unmuted.
Sure. Yeah. If you're interested in putting on muscle and the different recommendations I have for that, you can definitely check out muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. Both my nutrition and training book give guidelines on how to appropriately set up your nutrition and training at all levels, whether you are a beginner or whether you're an elite level bodybuilder. And if you're interested in whatever research does come out on this, you can certainly check out myself, Greg Nuckols, and Dr. Mike Zourdos' monthly research review, MASS, appropriately named for this podcast. That's Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. And of course, to get all of the insights from the 3D Muscle Journey team, where we coach drug-free bodybuilders and powerlifters, check out 3dmusclejourney.com.
Excellent. Dr. Mike?
Yeah, so just for good old fitness and really cool stuff on Instagram, at RP Strength. That's Renaissance Precision Instagram. We have like 100 trillion Instagram followers now, which is apparently good. So come be one of the many drones that mindlessly watches RP people eat food and whatever Instagram's for. I have no idea what the hell it's for. And then we actually just, myself and my colleagues just authored a really super cool book we're proud of, Recovering from Training, titled very exotically. And I believe the first book of its kind that tries to describe the entire theoretical and practical application of recovery to sort of educated lay people, intelligent lay people willing to learn. So it's got all the priorities of what's most important, least important about recovery, and it's got all of the practical recommendations, like you're supposed to get XYZ amount of sleep, and by the way, here's really good tips to how to make sure you get good sleep, et cetera, all the way down the line. It refutes a whole lot of myths about a recovery, of which there are no less than 10 trillion. Put cups on your face and shit. Apparently you're good to go. So that is available on renaissanceperiodization.com. Give it a look. We're super proud of the book. So maybe you can be our friend and read our stuff.
I can say, by the way, I'm reading that at the moment, and it's good.
Thank you. That's awesome. That's really good to hear.
Great. Cool. So next question, how much volume should we do? No, I'm just kidding.
All the volume. MRV, everybody.
All right. Excellent, gentlemen. This was an absolute pleasure, and I'm super honored that you both took the time.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, guys. I hope you enjoyed this. The conclusion of the debate, pretty tough to conclude, right? Okay, here's what I propose. Lament over what you just heard for a day or so. After this, will you bulk slower or faster? Just think about it for a while. And probably by the next day or the day after tops, I'll release a follow-up episode where we will try to summarize everything that we've just heard in this episode to help you process everything. That will be my little reflection on this debate, if you will. So if you're curious on that, don't forget to get back here. And hey, once again, please check out the resources that these guys mentioned. I'm sure you'll want to put what you've learned here into practice. So go ahead and check out the Muscle and Strength Pyramid books, as well as the Research Review Mass from Dr. Eric, and many of the awesome books on training, nutrition, and recovery management from Dr. Mike. As well, also consider checking out the RP Plus, which is the subscription service of Dr. Mike Israetel's company, Renaissance Periodization, where you can have weekly Q&As and tons of video lectures and things of that nature. And also, both of these guys have put out tons of awesome free resources that you can check out. So, if you're on a budget, you can give those a look as well. At any rate, thanks for hanging around until now, and see you next time. Ciao.